Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the guerrilla battlefields of Yugoslavia. These are his words. Let's begin. There could be no doubt about it, Tito had gone. As an indignant telegram from Mr. Churchill put it, he had levanted. One morning Vivian Street, who, in my absence, was in charge on Vis, had gone to visit him with a message from General Wilson, only to find that he had disappeared from the island without leaving a trace. Inquiries as to his whereabouts only elicited evasive replies. It was the old story, so familiar from Moscow days: he is sick, he is busy, he has gone for a walk. The more responsible members of the marshal's entourage seemed to have gone too. The others, if they knew anything, were too nervous to reveal it. On further investigation, it was discovered that an unidentified Russian aircraft had landed on Vis and taken off again, presumably with Tito on board. This sudden, unexplained departure did considerable harm to our relations with the partisans. In London and at Caserta, it was felt, not unnaturally, that such secretiveness was highly offensive, especially considering that without our support Tito would never have been able to remain on Vis, and that the present phase of the war called for the closest cooperation between allies. Moreover, in Tito's absence, there was no one from whom decisions could be obtained or with whom the day-to-day business of liaison could be conducted in a normal, friendly way. As a result, the causes of friction multiplied, and relations deteriorated. Clearly, the first thing was to find him again. There was no point in my going to Vis, let alone staying there. From what Tito had told me before I had left Vis, it seemed to me that the most probable explanation of his departure was that he had gone inland to coordinate the final phases of the struggle for Belgrade. The best place to look for him seemed to be Serbia, and I accordingly decided to go back there. Once again, my hopes of being in at the fall of Belgrade revived. Before leaving Bari, I made, with the help of our intelligence staff, a careful review of the military situation in Serbia, and, as a result of this, arrived at the conclusion that Peko Dapkovic, now thrusting northeastwards through western Serbia, was on the whole likely to reach Belgrade before Kojar Popovic. The big marked map at my rear headquarters, brought up to date in accordance with the latest situation reports, showed that his forward troops had just reached the town of Voljevo, in central Serbia, and it was here that, a couple of nights later, I was landed by Balkan Air Force, complete with a jeep and a wireless set. I was met by Freddie Cole of the Durham Light Infantry, my liaison officer with Peko Dapkovic, who had been dropped in some considerable time before and had accompanied 1st Corps on their epic march eastwards, taking an active part in the heavy fighting that had marked those eventful months. With Dapkovic, never an easy man, and with his officers, he had established cordial relations, and now his popularity had been further increased by the very timely air support that he had been able to call to the aid of the partisans. 1st Corps found Voljevo a tough nut to crack. The retreating Germans, for whom it was a key point, had decided to hold it at all costs, and the garrison had settled down to a last man, last round stand, centered on the fortress-like barracks, around which they had built up a well-planned system of defense. In the ensuing battle, the partisans suffered heavy casualties and did not succeed in dislodging the enemy until a pair of rocket-carrying Beaufighters, summoned from Italy, administered the coup de grace to the beleaguered garrison by swooping down and discharging their rockets at point-blank range into the barrack buildings. For the crew of one of the Beaufighters, this was their last operation, for, as they started to pull out of their dive, they ran into a final burst of anti-aircraft fire from the Germans, which sent them spinning to destruction a few hundred yards away. Their bodies were recovered from the wreck of their aircraft, and we buried them with full military honors in the graveyard of a little Orthodox church near the spot where they had met their death. The sudden fall of Voljevo took by surprise many of the local inhabitants who had come to terms with the enemy and now had not enough time to make good their escape. They included followers of Nedic, the quisling prime minister, and Aljotic, the leader of the Serbian fascist party, as well as some Chetniks. The facade of one man's house was still decorated with the inscription in yard-high letters, "Long live Aljotic." Death to the Bolshevik Raoul, which, despite frenzied last-minute efforts, he had not succeeded in erasing. The house in which we ourselves were quartered belonged to a leading Chetnik, who, while expressing the warmest attachment for the Allied cause, clearly found the departure of the Germans and the arrival of the partisans somewhat disconcerting. After we had been there a day or two, he disappeared, and we concluded that we should not see him again. A few days later, however, he reappeared, still nervous, but considerably relieved, having been tried as a collaborator, condemned to pay a fine to partisan funds, and then set free. At this time in Voljevo, there were numerous other arrests and trials on charges of collaboration with the enemy, but, as far as we could ascertain, the sentences passed were on the whole light, and there were relatively few death sentences. To the population, after all they had heard, such moderation on the part of the partisans seemed too good to be true, and there was, not unnaturally, much speculation as to how long it would last. Voljevo was a sizable market town, far larger than any of the villages we had seen so far. The shops were well stocked with local produce and German-made goods, and there was a restaurant where we could get our meals. Our Chetnik landlord, whatever his political record, was a man of good taste and education, and his house, with its wide windows opening onto a sun-drenched courtyard trellised with vines, was filled with readable books and pleasant pictures and furniture. Clumping about in our hobnailed boots on his well-polished floors, and gaping into the well-stocked shop windows, we hardly recognized ourselves in our new role of town dwellers. We had not been in Voljevo long when it started to fill up. Daily, more members of Tito's military and political entourage kept arriving, presumably ready to move into Belgrade at the first opportunity. Familiar faces began to make their appearance in the little inn where we had our meals, and one day, I found myself face to face with Cruni. Hitherto, I had not thought it worthwhile to raise with any of the partisans with whom I had come into contact the question of Tito's whereabouts, but this encounter gave me the opportunity I needed. Cruni, I knew, had sufficient grasp of the situation to appreciate, if it were explained to him, the resentment that was being caused in London and Caserta by Tito's disappearance, and, if he chose, was sufficiently sure of himself to help me clear the matter up. Making no attempt to hide my feelings, I told him plainly how Tito's conduct was viewed by the Allies and added that I would be grateful if he would at once convey to him a personal message from me. This he agreed to do, explaining that he was in wireless touch with the Marshal, who was at present in the Vojvodina. I accordingly sat down and drafted a stiff signal to Tito, emphasizing the effect that his absence was having on our mutual relations and asking for an early interview. To this they came back, within a few hours, a friendly answer from Tito, saying that he hoped we should meet in a few days. The deadlock, it seemed, had been broken, though the resentment was to linger for some time. Not long after reaching Voljevo, I received signals announcing the arrival of Vivian Street and Charlie Thayer. Vivian, whom I had at last reluctantly agreed to release in deference to repeated representations from his regiment, was due to join a battalion of the Rifle Brigade in Italy in a few days' time, and this was in the nature of a farewell visit. Charlie, an old friend from Moscow days, who, after numerous vicissitudes, had been seconded from the U.S. Foreign Service, now reappeared, with crossed sabers on his collar and an eagle on his shoulder, in the guise of a colonel of cavalry, thus harking back to a remote past when he had played polo for West Point and served, very briefly, under the command of the distinguished but irascible officer later to become famous as General Patton. His official designation was second in command to Colonel Ellery C. Huntington, who had succeeded poor Slim Farish, killed a few weeks before in Greece, as commander of the U.S. military mission to the partisans. I had hardly seen Charlie since the war. I looked forward to having with me someone who had shared my experience of Russia and who, like me, would be able to detect the reflections of Moscow so readily discernible in the Yugoslav scene. The military situation was now rapidly approaching a climax. The Red Army, having crossed the Danube, was advancing on Belgrade from the north and the east, and Crni confirmed that Peko Dapkovic's troops were to furnish the partisan contingent for the great battle now imminent. A large-scale daylight supply drop by Halifaxes of the RAF brought the partisans arms and ammunition for the coming offensive. Watching the great white nylon parachutes billow out and come floating down, I reflected that in Serbia, at any rate, this method of supply would soon be outdated. The fall of Belgrade could no longer be far removed. At Voljevo, as in so many other places, in the desert, in Bosnia, in Italy, Dalmatia and Serbia, we would turn our wireless set in the evenings to Radio Belgrade, and night after night, always at the same time, would come, throbbing lingeringly over the ether, the cheap, sugary, and yet almost painfully nostalgic melody, the sex-laden, intimate, heartrending accents of Lily Marlene. Not gone yet, we would say to each other. I wonder if we'll find her when we get there. Then one evening, at the accustomed time, there was silence. Gone away, we said. Vivian and Charlie had scarcely arrived at Voljevo when we moved eastwards to Arandelovac, some 40 miles due south of Belgrade. Now that we had jeeps and that many of the roads were in partisan hands, traveling was easy, and we reached Arandelovac in an hour or two. Once a well-known watering place, frequented by fashionable invalids from Belgrade, it was now in a sorry state, with its smart hotels blasted and scarred by shellfire, and the neatly laid-out public gardens trampled underfoot during the recent heavy fighting. From a broken pipe near the courthouse, mineral water was bubbling onto the grass, and we were able to fill our water bottles with what was reputed to be a sovereign remedy for digestive disorders. This was just as well. We had been given a rousing reception by the people of Arandelovac, who, after filling the jeep with bouquets of flowers, forced upon us food and drink of every kind and description. On top of all this, I was warmly greeted by a bibulous-looking individual who announced that he had once been chef to the British legation in Belgrade and was most anxious to resume his connection with the representative of His Britannic Majesty. We needed a cook, and so I took him on, after which we enjoyed, for the rest of our brief stay in Arandelovac, almost the best food I have ever tasted, perfect alike in its admirable materials and skillful preparation. Pork, for which Serbia is rightly famous, dominated our diet, the juiciest, tenderest, most succulent pork imaginable. There was roast pork, and grilled pork chops, and pig's trotters, and suckling pig, and bacon, and ham, and innumerable kinds of pork sausages, all swimming in the very best butter and lard. It may sound monotonous, it may even sound slightly disgusting. But at that time and in that place, after years during which such things had existed only in one's dreams, it was highly enjoyable. We felt that we were at last enjoying the fruits of victory. Nor was the preparation of pork by any means the only branch of his art at which this admirable man excelled. The richest soups, the most delicious omelettes, the most luscious preserves, layer upon layer of the lightest pastry mingled with the freshest cream cheese, all these delicacies, washed down by a variety of excellent wines, were lavished on us daily. Although we did not spend more than 2 or 3 days in Arandelovac, it was only by generous use of the local mineral water that any of us managed to avoid the effects of this constant overeating. Our cook had but one failing, and that, as I had suspected from the first, was a taste for drink. When, after each meal, he appeared to receive our felicitations, there would be a marked unsteadiness about his legs, a tendency to sit or even lie down suddenly, coupled with a no less disconcerting tendency to burst loudly and abruptly into song. It was this weakness that brought our happy association to a premature end. When the time came for us to leave Arandelovac, he was in no state to travel and had to be left behind. As it turned out, our departure from Arandelovac was a sudden one. On the night of October 19th, as we sat at dinner, we received the news that the final phase of the battle for Belgrade had begun. On learning this, we made arrangements to leave for the front at first light. October 20th dawned fine and fairly clear. It had rained during the night, and the lanes were muddy. With the Americans, we had 3 jeeps between us. Charlie Thayer, Ellery Huntington, and an American sergeant set out in one, Vivian Street and I in another, and Freddie Cole and his 2 wireless operators in a third. At first, we followed country lanes and cart tracks, between high green hedgerows glistening with raindrops. The fresh, moist landscape, a mixture of greys and browns and greens, had the softness of a watercolor. Entering a village, we found it full of the Red Army. Even in this Slav country, the Soviet troops looked strangely outlandish, with their high cheekbones, deeply sunburnt faces, and unfamiliar uniforms. But they seemed to be getting on well enough with the local population, laughing and joking with the village boys and girls in a kind of composite Slav language, midway between Serb and Russian. Red flags hung from some of the windows, and at the entrance to the village, a triumphal arch of cardboard had been erected in honor of the liberators. Thereafter we came upon Russians at every turn, in large bodies and in small, on foot, on horseback, in carts, trucks, armored cars, and tanks, all moving up to the front. They were certainly not smart. Their loosely fitting drab-colored uniforms were torn and stained and bleached by the sun and rain. The clothing of many had been supplemented or replaced by articles of equipment captured from the enemy. Their boots, as often as not, were completely worn out. The individual soldiers were an extraordinary medley of racial types, from the flaxen hair and blue eyes of the Norseman to the high cheekbones, slit eyes, and yellow complexion of the Mongol. But they looked as though they meant business. Ragged and unkempt though they might be, their powers of endurance and their physical toughness were self-evident. Their weapons, were clean and bright. They gave an indefinable impression of being immensely experienced, self-reliant, seasoned troops, accustomed to being left to fend for themselves and well able to do it. And all this, no doubt, they were, and more, for they had fought their way here from Stalingrad and the frontiers of Asia, and that fighting, we knew, had been no light matter. Most of them wore 2 or 3 campaign medals or decorations, not just ribbons or miniatures, but the full-sized bronze, silver, or enameled medals and stars themselves, clinking and jangling on their tunics. Somewhere in my kit, I had the large silver and platinum star of the Soviet Order of Kutuzov, which had been awarded me some months before, and, seeing that this was an occasion on which decorations were being worn, I dug it out and screwed it onto my battle dress tunic. This, and the fact that both Charlie and I could talk to them in their own language, had an immediate effect on the Russians, who came crowding around the jeep whenever we stopped, fingering our weapons and equipment admiringly and proudly exhibiting their own. Scattered over the fields through which we were passing, large numbers of derelict tanks and guns, some blasted by direct hits, others seemingly intact, testified to the violence of the battle that had been raging for the last 24 hours and was still in progress. Soviet heavy tanks predominated. In the space of a mile, we counted a dozen along the side of the track, their shattered hulks still smoking. Evidently, there was still some fight left in the German anti-tank gunners. 20 miles or so south of Belgrade, we emerged onto the main road and joined a continuous stream of Red Army trucks, tanks, and guns flowing northwards into battle. One thing in particular struck us now, as it had struck us from the first, namely, that every Soviet truck we saw contained one of two things: petrol or ammunition. Of rations, blankets, spare boots, or clothing, there was no trace. The presumption was that such articles, if they were required at all, were provided at the expense of the enemy or of the local population. Almost every man we saw was a fighting soldier. What they carried with them were materials of war in the narrowest sense. We were witnessing a return to the administrative methods of Attila and Genghis Khan, and the results seemed to deserve careful attention. For there could be no doubt that here lay one reason for the amazing speed of the Red Army's advance across Europe. Thinking it over, and recalling the numbers of dentists' chairs and filing cabinets that were said to have been landed in Normandy at an early stage of the Allied invasion, I wondered whether we ourselves could not perhaps profit to some extent by the Russian example. Every now and then, the stream of traffic was checked. Further on, the enemy was shelling the road, and progress was slowed up. Looking at the long defenseless crocodile of tanks and guns and vehicles stretching away into the distance, one felt thankful that the Luftwaffe was no longer in a position to take advantage of the tempting target that it offered. In one of the frequent traffic blocks, we found ourselves jammed against a Russian ammunition truck, liberally decorated with Soviet emblems. Its occupants, fearful, fair-haired lads scarcely out of their teens, were inordinately proud of it. "You can't produce this sort of thing in capitalist countries," they said smugly. From his jeep, meanwhile, Charlie's top sergeant, oblivious of what was being said, had been examining the Russian's truck closely and discovered what he had suspected all along, namely that, despite the red stars, hammers, and sickles that now adorned it, it was a Chevrolet, produced by General Motors at Detroit, Michigan. "It makes you sick," he observed, "to think of these god-damned Russian bastards having all this good American equipment." In the interests of inter-allied friendship, it seemed wiser to leave both remarks untranslated. For some time past, we had heard the noise of gunfire in the distance. Now, as we moved forward, the sounds of battle came closer. There was a whirring and wailing in the air, and from the muddy fields and tangled thickets on either side of the road came the rattle of machine gun fire and the thud of mortars. Before us, the Sugar Loaf Hill of Avila, crowned by Meshtrovich's monument to the fallen of the First War, loomed above the road. On its steep slopes, fighting seemed to be in progress. We could not now be more than 10 miles from Belgrade. We decided that, before going any further, we had better secure a more exact estimate of the military position than we had been able to obtain hitherto. The Russians had established an artillery command post in a tumble-down cottage near the road, and here we turned aside to seek information. We found the post occupied by a lieutenant and a couple of sergeants, friendly souls, who, finding that we spoke their language, at once made us welcome. Soon all of us, including the family of peasants who owned the cottage, were sitting on the only bed, drinking hot milk and some kind of raw alcohol, eating black bread, and listening to a detailed account, not only of the immediate military situation but of the lieutenant's own war experiences and of his early life and childhood in faraway Vologda. In a flash, I was back in the Soviet Union, the taste of the food and drink, the stuffiness of the little wooden shack, the cold outside, the heat inside, the droning voices, the soft inflections of spoken Russian, the stereotyped Soviet jargon, and, of all, the smell, that indefinable composite aroma of petrol, sheepskin, vodka, black bread, cabbage soup, Soviet scent, and unwashed human bodies, which permeates every square inch of the Soviet Union and which Russians somehow manage to take with them wherever they go. From our newfound friend, we learned that, in the night, a large force of the enemy, which in the confusion of the retreat had become isolated from the main body, had sought to cross the road at about this point in a desperate attempt to fight their way through to join the German garrison in Belgrade before they were finally cut off. The result had been a battle of exceptional ferocity, which had raged over this part of the road all night long in the rain and the darkness. Now, the issue was no longer in doubt. Practically the entire enemy force, numbering many thousands, had been annihilated. The road was again more or less clear. It only remained to liquidate isolated pockets of resistance. The thought of this victory and of the accompanying slaughter of the enemy had clearly put the lieutenant in the best of humors. As he drank his hot milk, a broad grin spread over his broad, faintly mongoloid countenance. He confided, come to hate the Germans more than anything else on earth. He himself had fought against them for 3 years and found them brutal, inhuman enemies. They had overrun and destroyed his village and massacred his mother and sisters. His only brother had been killed fighting against them. He was glad now to see them finally routed and crushed. In this last battle, he said, they had not taken many Germans alive. I asked him what they did with their prisoners. If they surrender in large groups, he said, we send them back to base, but if, he added, there are only a few of them, we don't bother, and he winked. I wondered how many prisoners it took to constitute a large group. With the knowledge that the road before us was more or less clear, we continued our journey. Hitherto we had only come upon an occasional dead body, sprawled in the mud beside the wreckage of the tanks and guns. Now corpses littered the sides of the road, piled one on another, some in the field grey of the Wehrmacht, others stripped of their boots and uniform and left lying half naked, hundreds and hundreds of them, their pale faces disfigured with mud stains, greenish-grey upon the greenish-grey skin. As we passed, the sickly stench of death struck our nostrils, hanging heavy on the air. The troops who had tried to fight their way out were a composite force, hurriedly thrown together from elements of half a dozen different divisions, and, looking at the dead, we recognized many familiar badges, the Edelweiss of the 1st Alpine and the double Thunderbolt of the Prinz Eugen. The tables had indeed been turned since we stood opposite these same formations in those early, precarious days in the mountains of Bosnia. Further along, we passed a great throng of prisoners going in the opposite direction. Many had been left with only their shirts and underpants, and they shivered as they hobbled along in the chilly autumn air, their faces as grey from cold and fear as those of their dead comrades. As we watched, one of the guards appropriated a pair of boots that had somehow passed unnoticed and put them on, leaving their former owner to continue on his way barefoot. Soon after, Vivian pointed to the side of the road. Looking in the direction in which he was pointing, I saw 100 or more corpses, lying in rows, one upon the other, like 9 pins knocked over by the same ball. They had clearly not died in battle. A small batch, said Vivian. The smell, sweet and all-pervading, was stronger than ever. Already, we were approaching the outskirts of Belgrade. The road, which until now had twisted in and out around the contours of the hills, became straight and broad, with an impeccable surface in the best Autobahn style. It was the first tarmac road I had seen in Yugoslavia. Our little convoy of 3 jeeps bowled merrily along. The thunder of the heavy guns grew louder and more distinct. Over the city, a dive bomber, black against the watery blue of the sky, got into position and, as we watched, went hurtling down towards its target. Meeting a partisan, we asked where General Pecco had his headquarters, and were directed to a villa in a residential suburb outside the town. But when we got there, it was only to find that Pecco had moved elsewhere. A rear party was busy packing themselves and their belongings into a truck. The position proved somewhat inconvenient, one of them explained, a series of deafening explosions from nearby gardens lending force to his remark, as the enemy, wherever they were, settled down to shell the neighborhood in earnest. Taking advantage of his offer to pilot us to the general's new headquarters, we climbed back into our jeeps with as much nonchalance as we could muster and followed him gratefully back to the comparative quiet of the outer boulevards. We found Pecco installed in a house on the outskirts of the town. He was about to have lunch and invited us to join him. The house in which he had set up his headquarters had belonged to a millionaire and was furnished with extreme richness, and the meal that we now ate was of excellent quality and luxuriously served. Having washed it down with plenty of good local red wine, we felt much refreshed and ready for anything. Taking Pecco's chief of staff with us, we set out in our jeeps to see for ourselves how things were going. The chief of staff, we soon found, had only a rather sketchy idea of the geography of Belgrade. But as none of the rest of us had ever been there before, we left the task of navigation to him, and, under his direction, plunged gaily into the center of the town. Our first objective was the Kalemegdan. This, it appeared, was some kind of fort, which had just been taken and from which we should be able to follow the progress of the fighting. The streets through which we approached it were under heavy shellfire. They were also crowded with civilians, some enthusiastic, some just standing and gaping. From time to time a shell would land full amongst them, killing several. This left the Chief of Staff unmoved. Sitting beside me in the front of my jeep, he was busy showing us the sights of Belgrade, which he had not visited since he was a child. That, he would say, is the Parliament building. And there is the opera. And now I am afraid we have lost the way again. Ah, that must be the Ministry of Agriculture. From the back of the jeep, Vivian, who, as a seasoned infantryman, had had considerable experience of long-range shelling and its results, was beginning to show signs of impatience. Mightn't it be better, he would suggest politely, as we swerved down yet another side street, littered with the same little heaps of fresh corpses, mightn't it be better to go straight there? But the Chief of Staff was not to be put off. Accustomed to the hand-to-hand fighting of guerrilla warfare, long-range shelling meant little to him. Whatever happened, and even though he might not be quite sure of the way, he was determined to do the honors of the capital in proper style. Next, we tried to guess where the shells were coming from and what they were aimed at. But even that was not easy. Nor did the Chief of Staff himself seem to have a very clear idea of the situation. One thing only was evident, that heavy fighting was going on all around us. The thunder of artillery and the rattle of small arms fire resounded from all sides. It was not until we finally reached our destination that we got a clear picture of what was happening. The Kalemegdan is an ancient fort, built of stone and red brick, from which, in Turkish times, the Ottoman conquerors held sway over Belgrade and the surrounding country. We approached it on foot through what seemed to be some public gardens, having first left the jeeps under the cover of a clump of bushes. As far as we knew, the Kalemegdan itself was in Soviet or partisan hands, but in the immediate neighborhood, skirmishing was still in progress, and through the trees came the occasional crack of a rifle or a burst of fire from a machine gun. It was not without caution that we wended our way amongst the ornamental flower beds and clumps of shrubs. "Keep off the grass," said the notices unavailingly. Suddenly, we emerged from the trees onto a kind of terrace and found ourselves looking out over an immense panorama, in which, as in certain medieval paintings, all sorts of things were happening simultaneously. At our feet, a few hundred yards away, flowed the Danube. Here, the point where it joined the Sava, it was a considerable stream, its rushing waters swollen by the autumn rains. Of the bridges spanning it, only one remained standing, about half a mile from where we stood. Across this, troops were pouring headlong, guns, vehicles, horses, and infantry. Looking through our glasses, we saw that they were Germans, retreating in confusion to the suburb of Zemmun across the river, where, it seemed, the main body of the enemy was now established and whence their guns were laying down a barrage to cover the retreat of their rearguard. Suddenly, as we watched, the stream of fugitives was broken, and for a few moments, the bridge remained unoccupied. Then more troops came pouring across. As we focused our glasses on them, we saw, to our amazement, that they were Russians. We could hardly believe our eyes. It seemed incredible that the German sappers should have failed to blow up the bridge as soon as their last troops were across. And yet there could be no doubt about it. They had. Already the first Russians had reached the other side and were deploying on the flat ground between Zemmun and the river. Calmly, methodically, the guns, horse-drawn for the most part, were brought into position and opened up, little puffs of smoke among the buildings of Zemmun showing that they were finding their targets. Then, as we watched, the Red Infantry went into action, wave upon wave, advancing unhurriedly but relentlessly across the shell-scarred fields, firing as they went. Some were armed with Tommy guns or rifles, others dragged behind them heavy machine guns mounted on little wheels. Every now and then, one of the sturdy, buff-clad figures would spin around and fall while the advance swept on past him. On the fringes of Zemmun, the harassed Germans were standing fast and returning the Russians' fire as they tried frantically to dig themselves in. It was not until later that we heard the story of the bridge. The Germans, it appeared, had duly mined it before they began their withdrawal, and a detachment of engineers had been detailed to blow it up as soon as the last troops were over. The rest of the story reads like a fairy tale. In one of the apartment houses near the bridge, there lived an old man, a retired schoolteacher. He was warlike neither by nature nor by training, but in the course of a long life, he had had one outstanding military experience. This was during the Balkan War of 1912, when, in the course of a battle with the Turks, he had, as a private soldier, distinguished himself by removing the demolition charges from beneath a bridge across which the enemy was retreating, thus preventing them from destroying it and enabling the Serbs to follow up their advantage. For this deed, he was awarded a gold medal by King Peter I. After which he took to schoolmastering and relapsed into obscurity. 32 years later, on the night of October 19, 1944, the old man, armed with his solitary but valuable experience of modern warfare and with a stout heart, was looking out of his window as the Germans made preparations for their withdrawal. With growing interest, he watched them laying and connecting up the charges under the supports of the bridge. This was something familiar, something in his line. He knew exactly what to do. Biding his time, he chose a moment when the attention of the guards on the bridge had been distracted. Then, of his own initiative, he went downstairs, crossed the road, and devoted a well-spent half-hour to disconnecting the charges under the bridge. When, some hours later, the enemy's demolition party tried to detonate the charges, nothing happened, and, before they could put things right, the Russians were upon them. Some weeks later, a second gold medal was awarded to the old man. As we watched, more and more Soviet troops poured across the bridge, and the fighting on the Zemmun side became fiercer than ever. In a desperate attempt to make up for their fatal failure to destroy the bridge, the Germans now turned the full force of their remaining artillery against it. From where we were, we could see the shells bursting in the water all around it. Every now and then one would find its target, and for a moment, the smooth flow of troops across the bridge would be interrupted by plunging horses and lurching, swaying vehicles. But somehow the seemingly flimsy structure of the bridge itself stood firm, and still, the Russians came on. Up to now, we had watched these remarkable scenes spellbound, as though from a grandstand. Suddenly, the sound of a gun going off in our immediate neighborhood reminded us that we ourselves were not so far removed from the battle area. Looking around, we saw that a Soviet gun crew had established themselves with their 75mm field gun in the bushes 20 yards away from us and were now firing over open sights at the enemy on the other side of the river. This, we realized at once, could only lead to one thing. And, indeed, retribution followed swiftly. The comparative peace and quiet of our ringside seats were rudely disturbed as the German gunners across the river, resenting this challenge to their professional pride, retaliated with some painfully accurate counter-battery fire. A first shell fell to the right of where we were standing, then one to the left, then one over us, then one short of us. It was without displeasure that we received the Chief of Staff's announcement that it was time for us to get back to headquarters. In the streets through which we drove on our way back, we found the same bewildered crowds as before. At the sight of the Union Jack on my Jeep and of the stars and stripes on Charlie's, some of the onlookers raised a cheer. The Germans were concentrating their fire on the streets leading down to the bridge. Along these, Red Army and partisan reinforcements were now pouring, and again, we had to drive our Jeeps up onto the pavement to make way for the Russian gun teams, as, at full gallop, with a clatter of hooves and a rattle of wheels on the cobbles, they went swaying and jerking into battle. The Chief of Staff had one last bit of sightseeing in store for us. We must, he said, have a look at the British legation. In the end, we found it, with the Swiss flag flying over it, an unmistakable product of the Office of Works. Georgian or Queen Anne in intention, it nevertheless somehow managed, with its high-pitched roof and artfully toned brickwork, to give the intangible impression of Tudor homeliness, which, for some reason, is thought to be called for in the buildings that today are designed to house His Majesty's representatives abroad. The body of a German soldier lay spread-eagled near the front door. By the time we reached Pecco's headquarters, it was nearly dark. We had seen enough from the Kalamegdan to know that the issue of the battle could no longer be in doubt, and what Pecco now told us confirmed this. In the battle before Belgrade and in the fighting within the city itself, the greater part of the German garrison had been annihilated. The survivors were trying to make a stand in Zemmun, across the river, in the hope of thus gaining a little time before continuing their retreat northwards and westwards. Shells from Zemmun were still falling freely in Belgrade, but, with the exception of a few isolated pockets of resistance, now being mopped up, there were no Germans left in the city. As I walked back down the street to the little suburban villa in which we were quartered, the evening sky over Belgrade was bright with innumerable phosphorescent streams of tracer bullets soaring upwards from all sides and at all angles, and the rattle of firearms was continuous. The Russians and the partisans were celebrating their victory in their own way. Coming down the street towards me was a group of Red Army soldiers, who from time to time, discharged their Tommy guns in the air or, as a variation, straight in front of them down the street. As they went past, they shouted merrily to me. Above the pandemonium came the occasional crash of a German shell, and now, from quite near, an entirely new noise as a Soviet Kashishka, or multiple rocket projector, went into action. With a rushing, whirring, hissing sound, like a giant locomotive letting off steam, 5 or 6 rockets soared up from behind our house and, trailing after them a wake of fire, went speeding off in the direction of Zemune to land there a few seconds later with a flash and a muffled explosion. Soon the Germans opened up with the inevitable counter-battery fire, and once again the shells began to fall all around us in earnest. Against this background of noise, I sat down to draft my signal to the Supreme Allied Commander, announcing the fall of Belgrade. It was a signal that I had looked forward to sending for a long time. That concludes the 23rd part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.